finally, a source of raw, real, and honest information on healthcare issues that matter most. Welcome to BS Free MD. From the latest medical information to how to stay sane as a doctor or a patient, no subject is taboo, no BS is allowed. Now, let's welcome your hosts, Doctors May and Tim Hindmarsh.
All right, welcome back to BS Free MD. We're going to do something a little bit different tonight. I am flying solo. May is out of town. And we're going to start something called Medical Mavericks, where we get into some medical history that I think hopefully is very entertaining and informative, and most of all instructive on, what in the wide world of sports is going on right now. There's so much going on in the world of medicine and health and medical freedom and all of these kind of things that we take for granted, some really good things and some really bad things that have happened in the past. So I really want to start cracking that nut and going down some rabbit holes with regards to medical history and how some of the most important discoveries, some of the most day-to-day things we take for granted that have really enriched people's lives or made them horrible, as today's case may be, center around certain personalities. And a lot of this is like there's a single person that, brought us defibrillation. There's a single person that kind of launched all vaccinology. There's all these different historical people that we can learn from. And I'd like to call them Medical Mavericks. So today's story is I think I have a Canadian accent or something a little bit, is the story of thalidomide. So anyone who knows anything about drugs of the last 70 years knows what thalidomide is. It's a drug that caused horrible birth defects. But the story is fascinating. And the most important part of the story for us in the United States is why it was never marketed in the United States. And that's because of one person. So we're going to talk about the problem, which is the drug, the person, in this case, an amazing physician named Francis Kelsey, and then the legacy. So first off, the problem. Well, thalidomide, why did it exist? We all know it caused these problems. Ancient history, talk to our parents, depending on how old you are, grandparents in a lot of cases. It was solving a sedative problem. So it was a sedative hypnotic. In other words, it helped you sleep, it helped with anxiety, and it was marketed by the German drug company Grunenthal as suicide proof. Okay, well, why was that a big deal? Well, because the other sedatives in the mid-1950s, this drug was first discovered in 1953, were barbiturates. And barbiturates were actually pretty easy to overdose on, a la Marilyn Monroe. At least allegedly, that's the case. We're not going down that rabbit hole tonight. So barbiturates, especially when combined with alcohol, can be really dangerous drugs. They're amazing from a put you to sleep perspective. They'll knock you on your ass, no problem. But that was an issue. So thalidomide is going to, solve that. It was going to be the suicide-proof sedative. They even had a case report of a guy that took, I think, over 100 of them, and he just woke up hungover. He wasn't dead. So the drug was marketed heavily in Germany as very safe, no side effects, and it was going to be the wonder drug with regards to sedatives. It eventually also worked its way into the obstetrical world as a drug used for morning sickness. Okay. So as the rest of the story unravels, it's going to be like, how in the hell did that happen? Well, I'm going to explain it to you. So the suicide proof sedative, get a good night's sleep, wake up, feel fine, go to work, everybody's happy. So the drug was released around 1957 or so in Germany, had been over the counter actually in Germany, and was used extensively there. It was used fairly extensively in 46 countries in the world. But The drug company that owned the rights to American distribution was a company called Merrill, and Merrill wanted to market this in the United States as a prescription drug, so they had to go through the FDA. FDA started way back in about 1938, so the FDA had been around for a while, but the laws were much different in 1960 than they were in 1938, and they're way different now than they were then. So Merrill starts, marketing the drug to physicians through a loophole, which was if a drug was experimental, you could give it to doctors and they could give it to patients. And they didn't even have to tell the patient that it was experimental. And you could just kind of see what happens. And you would, build your medical database just by doctors playing with stuff. So they had actually marketed it fairly heavily in the United States, to the tune of several million pills, and about 2.5 million pills, and about 20,000 patients had taken it before they went to the FDA with a new drug approval application, or an NDA, to try to get it fully into the US market. Well, now enters the person. So this is Frances Kelsey, or Frankie Kelsey. I'm just going to read her bio. It's an excellent bio. I'm borrowing this from the National Women's History Museum. They wrote a really nice bio just to give you a sense for kind of who she was. Just an amazing person, and like a genius. So Frankie Kelsey was universally credited with sparing the U.S. the damage inflicted by the drug thalidomide to the human nervous system by refusing to approve the drug for distribution in the U.S. As a result of her actions, major changes in drug relations in the U.S. resulted, and the rest of the world. We'll talk about that. She was born in the rural Cobb Island on Vancouver Island in British Columbia in 1914. She was the second child of an Austrian father and Scottish mother, and she was known as Frankie her whole life. She learned to read by listening to her mother teach her 2-year-old brother. She wanted to be a scientist from a very young age and graduated high school at 15. She then earned a bachelor's degree in 1934 at McGill University in Montreal at 20, hoping to go into lab work. However, she graduated at the height of the Depression, and few jobs were available to women. We're going to get back to that because I think that's a really important part of this story. Instead, Kelsey obtained a master's degree in pharmacology in 1935. After finishing that degree, a professor urged her to study at the University of Chicago with E.M.K. Gehling, who established the country's first pharmacology lab. She eventually earned a PhD in pharmacology, becoming the first woman to do so. So she worked a little bit with this Gehling guy at the FDA contract to find out why 71 adults and 34 children died after taking a new antibacterial product, which was sulfanilamide. So it's a sulfa drug. Turned out to have diethylene glycol in it, which was antifreeze. Whoopsie. So that pharmaceutical disaster resulted in legislative changes in the 1906 Food and Drug Act, known as the 1938 Food and Drug and Cosmetic Act, where for the first time, producers of a product had to actually list the ingredients. And they had to test for safety and approval by the FDA, and its major advancement in consumer protection. Next, Kelsey and another pharmacologist, Fremont Ellis, worked to find a substitute for quinine, a necessary component in a malaria medication, also a necessary component in a gin and tonic, in my opinion. And, she just was scientisting like crazy until in 1943, she got married, had 2 kids, and her husband got a job at this medical facility, and they said 2 people that were like married couldn't work at the same facility. So then she just decided she would go to medical school. And she went to medical school and became a physician. And then the Kelseys moved on to the University of South Dakota. and she completed a fellowship in radioisotopes. So I think that would be like basically the beginning of radiation oncology. And then they moved to Washington, D.C., and she took a job at the FDA. And I think she actually got the job as the head of the new drug application division of the FDA. So, wow. So she's clearly a genius, graduated high school at 15, and had a bachelor's degree by the time she was 20 years old. And then, the first woman to get a PhD in pharmacology, and then went to medical school after that. So she arrives at the FDA, and we'll get back to the story here, where Joseph Murray, he's the rep for the drug company Merrill, is trying to get thalidomide approved for prescription use in the United States. Well, it starts to get kind of interesting, because Dr. Kelsey sees their application and just doesn't think it's adequate, the application. And so there was a law at that time that if you applied to the FDA had 60 days to approve the drug. And if they didn't approve it, it was automatically approved. So she was always under this 2-month window. But there was a loophole in that regulation which said that, you could send it back to the drug company and basically stall for time if you didn't think that it was a completed application. And so she did this several times. Meanwhile, nobody in the United States has any clue that there's any real issue with thalidomide, which is hard to comprehend because it's been prescribed in all of these other countries for several years now. And so she was obviously a diligent scientist. There's a great, an excellent podcast from Scientific American that I referenced for this podcast. And I read the transcript, and it's really quite interesting because they have her daughter, and they interview her daughter, and they're like, for fun, her dad, who was a pharmacologist scientist, and her mother would read medical journals in the evenings as relaxation from journals from all over the world. So they would get this stack of journals from all over the world, and she would just kind of keep up that way. And that was relaxing for her. I guess there was no Masked Singer in 1960. So at any rate, she stumbles upon a letter to the editor in, I think it was don't quote me, I think it was the British Medical Journal, that this doctor is just like, is thalidomide causing problems with peripheral neuropathy? Because there'd be patients that would take it, and then they would get like leg numbness, and it would be kind of weird. Well, so she starts sniffing around, and lo and behold, there was, to the point where the drug distributor in England, a company called Distillers, which is a beautiful name for a drug company, but that's another story, had actually put a warning label on the drug that it could cause, peripheral neuritis or peripheral neuropathy. This was known to Merrill, the drug company in the United States, and they just kind of blew it off and didn't put it in their application. So now Kelsey is like, okay, this doesn't really make sense. What's going on? Meanwhile, back in Germany, a young man named Karl Schulte-Hillen had just had a child with basically no arms and no legs, which is called phocomelia or seal limbs is the rough translation. So if you can imagine a child that basically is a trunk and little stump legs and little stump arms, that kind of like me, but even more grotesque. So this was crazy. He's like, what in the world is going on here? So this guy was a young, just graduated law school, and he's like, this doesn't make any sense. And the reason he was triggered to it doesn't make sense is his sister-in-law had a similar child, and just a couple towns away from where he lived. And he's like, this doesn't make 2 kids. I mean, phocomelia happens. It's about 1 in 100,000 births. So it's super rare, but it's absolutely heard of. It's not like it's not, it's entirely unheard of. So he interestingly starts pounding the pavement, and he finally finds this pediatrician and geneticist, a guy named Willikund Lenz. So Willikund Lenz is the son of Fritz Lenz, who was a Nazi eugenicist. And Fritz Lenz was the guy that was, I think he actually wrote the law in the 30s before all the real craziness of World War II about how they should restrict certain people from being, from ever getting pregnant, sterilizing people that are inferiors, all of this racist Nazi stuff. So Willikund was not like his father. He actually ended up becoming one of the biggest advocates in the world for disabled children, which is kind of crazy. His dad was like literally wanting to gas disabled children, and his son was, completely the opposite. So Carl Schulte-Hillen and Willikund Lenz start canvassing Germany. They start talking to other doctors. They literally went into pubs and they said, "Hey, here's a picture of my son. Do you know anybody that has kids like this?" And it blew up. And they figured out there was hundreds and hundreds of kids. So it's like way, way past what the normal rate of, the base rate of phocomelia would be. And they're like, what is going on? But the thing that's interesting is, from today, looking back from, what we're used to today, it took 4 years to even see that there was kids born with no arms and no legs. Like these absolutely grotesque malformations. And so, the drug was just continuing to be used. And they just couldn't make the connection that it was this drug and the malformations like were connected together. So like you would think, like common sense would be like, if there's all of these kids and they all have the same thing and it's way out of proportion to what it should be, it's got to be a toxin, which is what they figured. One guy surmised that it was nuclear testing that was doing it. There was all sorts of theories, but it seemed like forever for them to figure out that what was in common with all of these women was that they had taken thalidomide for either sedation or morning sickness. And interestingly, East Germany, so the communist part of Berlin and the communist part of Germany never approved thalidomide. They had none of these cases. So you think of it, today's, there would have been a face group, place, a face group or whatever you call those things for parents with kids with this problem. And you would have had the hive mind of the entire world going, what did you do? Did you drink coffee? Did you drink alcohol? Did you take a drug? Did you do this? And it's amazing how you can uncover things today. So much so to the point where you get inundated with so much information that you kind of choke on it and you don't know what's bullshit and what's real. But back then it was the opposite problem. I mean, this is what, 62, 63 years ago. They just couldn't make these connections because, interestingly, another legacy from the Nazis is the Germans were so in to taking records of malformations and people born with malformations and congenital problems for the death camps so that they could get rid of all the inferior, of the species and purify the Aryan race, that after World War II, now you're getting close to 20 years after World War II, they didn't want to keep these records anymore because they were, scared to death that they were going to be like the Nazis were. So even that detail post World War II, if they would have kept really good records of this is how many kids were born with whatever malformations throughout the country, it would have triggered like an instant, oh my gosh, what's going on? What do we need to do? But because they weren't doing, that strictly anymore, because that reminded them of like this absolutely dark period that the entire world and obviously their country went through, they weren't keeping these records. So it was like, again, another quirk of, the evil of Nazism was, this fear of keeping records in, they're going to shame or look like they were going to shame disabled people or whatever. Like it's just crazy. So anyways, eventually they figured out that the toxin was thalidomide. And Merrill finally, figured out it was never going to happen. They removed their application, and Dr. Kelsey was a hero because she stood her ground. She stood on scientific principles, and she literally changed the world of drug approval almost single-handedly, which is really amazing. But I want to do a little bunny trail here that I think is super interesting. She did this in 1960. And think of the man's world that she was living in 1960. She was made to feel a little bit guilty for taking her FDA job because she was taking it away. Because the thinking at that time was she was taking it away from a man that needed to support his family. But she was clearly the most, from a meritocracy perspective, she was the best for the job. She had all of this experience from even before she, married her husband and had kids and all this. She was in the lab right from the end of her PhD, and she was a physician. So she was the perfect fit for this job. But I mean, this is Mad Men era. And here's this woman that's the head of new drug approvals. So I got to hand it to these guys for picking the right person, and for her, she's unbelievably courageous. And, we lose a sense of history because we always think that things they're just old and different, but the culture was different then. And she was still able to compete and rise to the top in that culture. And it's just amazing. So let's get to the legacy. And I think what the best way to do this is we're going to listen to a little bit of an interview from 1962. So this is right after this happened, by the CBC in Canada. They interviewed her in DC. So here we go.
Really necessary, Dr. Kelsey, to use humans in these experiments with new drugs?
Yes, in the last analysis, I think it is, after thorough animal studies have been done.
Why is this?
Well, because the animals don't always handle the drug in the same way as humans.
So listen to that. Okay, so this is 1962, and he's questioning whether or not you should do more than animal studies. Well, here's the thing. They didn't even require animal studies. How things were done back then is you basically just distributed these drugs. Doctors played with them. They tried them out, and you kind of, oh, this worked good. This didn't do, this had side effects, whatever. And it was all basically anecdotal evidence. It was no real randomized controlled trials. So that one is like a complete mind blower when you think of it. So let's listen to a little bit more.
Dr. Morell in Ottawa just explained that the Canadian Food and Drug Directorate is limited in its powers. It can't be an all-powerful guardian of every mouthful of food and pill that's swallowed. Is that pretty much the same story with the Food and Drug Administration here?
I think we have the same problems that they do, yes.
Is there any way that this can be overcome, or is it just a...
Well, we have such a vast job and shortage of personnel and of budget that I think any new laws or regulations that might help us to tighten up and make easier our task for evaluation of the safety of the products.
So I find that interesting. It's like you can't test everything. You can't make everything safe. And there's no amount of budget, there's no amount of work, there's no amount of studies that's going to change that. You can make things safer. Nothing is safe. And that's what drives me crazy about this safe and effective, safe and effective, safe and effective. Nothing is safe. If water was a prescription drug, in the prescribing information, it would have warnings for hyponatremia. If you consume too much water over too short a period of time, you will wash out your sodium. This is a condition that can lead to death and can lead to, blah, 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 blah. Because it's true. Like water isn't even safe, and it's absolutely essential for life. So as soon as you start hearing safe and effective, you know it's bullshit, because everything has side effects, and it's wildly difficult to try to predict what they're going to be until you've got, several million prescriptions. I think of so many drugs like fen is my personal favorite. I mean, that was the Ozempic of the 1990s. And, it was prescribed reasonably heavily, and then all of a sudden heart valve damage. And, but it took years. to figure that out. So I'm going to fast forward here a little bit and get towards the end of this interview, because I think it's really interesting for us from the legacy perspective.
Cataracts and hair to fall.
Okay, here we go.
Testing, sometimes it requires many, many patients and a long period of study.
In the experimental use of thalidomide in the United States, about how many people did take the drug?
In the neighborhood of 15,000, I believe.
Have there been any reports at all of thalidomide babies here?
Not that I know of, no.
Well, could such a thing as this thalidomide scare happen again in the United States?
Well, I suppose drugs just are very complicated, and it's very difficult to be absolutely sure, but I think with thorough testing in advance, one can eliminate a great deal of the hazards.
Holy cow, I just got chills. That is like 62 years ago. Could anything like this thalidomide thing ever happen again in the United States? It can't possibly happen. We're all sciencey scientists. Holy crap. Could it happen again? Yeah, and it has. Not that, well, it's happened worse. Right, kids? Way worse. Way worse. But again, that's part of the legacy. So let's get down to what actually happened legislatively. So change in FDA laws, the Kiefhofer, man, I cannot even read my own notes because I write so terrible. I must be a doctor. The Kiefhofer-Harris Amendment got rid of the 60-day turnaround. You could take, the FDA could basically take I think as long as they wanted. It mandated animal trials, did a whole bunch of stuff it basically flipped what was going on upside down. So essentially you could bring a drug, fill out an application, and the due diligence was on the side of the FDA to show that it wasn't safe or it wasn't effective. The Kiefhofer-Harris Amendment essentially said, no, it's up to the drug company. They got to show that it's effective, and they got to show it's safe. And then as time has gone by, we've had, more amendments to this, more and more regulation, and, until it's the day we live in now. So the thing that gets me when I think of regulation is, people on the conservative side, let the market sort it out. Let the market sort it out. Well, what would it have taken for the market to sort out thalidomide? It was marketed for 4 years. It was over the counter. It was taken like crazy, and it still took over 4 years to figure out that it essentially allowed you to turn your fetus into a seal, not a Navy SEAL, like a SEAL. Not cool, like super duper not cool. So there's some things where you need a referee. You have to have regulations. There's not even a question of this. I mean, as much as I hate speed limits, I'm glad we have them, and I'm glad we have law enforcement for that. So it's an integral part of having an infrastructure to have some regulation. there's no football game without the referees. Yet the referees should not be part of the game. They shouldn't be deciding the game. They shouldn't be calling the game unfairly. A well-reffed game, you don't really know they're there. But there's no game without them. So there really is no safe and effective, or safer and effective, without some form of regulator, some form of referee. The problem that we find ourselves in now, and this is the problem with regulation creep, is, Key Pfeiffer, or however you say that, Harris Amendment was important. It was critical for safer drugs and more effective drugs. It was critical. The problem is, with every amendment, with every law that's passed, the bureaucracy gets bigger and bigger and bigger and more complex and harder to manage and harder to get rid of and more entrenched. And on the other side, it becomes more expensive for the drug companies to produce drugs, which means if they're going to produce things, it's really important for them to try to capture the FDA, right? Like what I believe has happened now is where we have corporate capture of the regulators, which is like paying off the refs in a football game. And so the regulation is great on one side because you have to have it, but it needs to be uncorrupted. And once it's corrupted, it's actually worse. And if you think of the last 4 years, I think it's obviously worse than if it was just unregulated. So now we're at a point where we do need to make America healthy again. Apparently this was a campaign donation. So the only campaign donation I've made in my entire life was buying this hat. So you're welcome, Bobby. And so you got to have a referee. You got to have an uncorrupted referee. I think that these, because it's like abolish the FDA, abolish the, no, I don't want to live in a world where there's no drug regulation. At the same time, I don't want to live in a world where there's corrupted regulators, because it's worse than having no drug regulation. And that's the tension that we're under. You get one side and it's like, it's corrupted, get rid of it. Okay, well, that's like saying, somebody was sexually assaulted on my street, so let's get rid of sex. No, let's get rid of criminals. And so that's the house cleaning I hope goes on in the next few years. And, elections coming up, and you know how I feel about that. So whatever happened to Dr. Kelsey, she actually ended up writing lots of the laws that govern drug tests. She became the director of the FDA Office of Scientific Investigations. And JFK gave her the Distinguished Federal Civilian Service Award for saving literally millions of children from the horrors of thalidomide. So that's amazing. What's equally as amazing is she ended up working at the FDA into her 90s, and she passed away at 101. And she actually ended up getting the Canadian Order of Canada, which just before she passed away. She actually went back to Canada and lived with her daughter, and that's where she passed away. So really an amazingly well-lived life. Maybe the secret to living to 101 isn't not smoking and not drinking and staying fit. It's never retiring. If that's, I don't know. I'm going to take my chances on that one. But anyways, we've come to the end of this story for now. I hope it's inspiring. It was super inspiring for me to do this research. I find it I love history of what I do and understanding how things work by looking through the lens of the past. We're going to do more of these. I got some doozies on the war on drugs and all sorts of other stuff that we'll be working on. And so spread the word, get on our socials, let people know that you love listening to us, give us a 5-star rating, put anything in the comments that helps boost the algorithm as well. And until next time, stay smart, do your own research, and stay BS free.
It's no secret that medicine is a bit uptight. That's why Tim and I created BS Free MD, to mix things up a little and have fun in the process. Besides, we are having these exact same discussions all the time, so we thought we might as well invite everyone to the party. If you really like us, you can get plenty more and maybe see one of Tim's cool tattoos on our Instagram or Facebook pages at BS-free-MD. See you next time.
But we try to keep BS-free-MD as raw and real as possible. We can't be held responsible for any medical decisions or discussions had as a result of what you've heard on the show. We know, bummer. But the truth is, we really do care about your questions. So feel free to reach out to us by email at doc@bsfreemd.com.